good to be here with you all. I love that there's a timer here because I am not time-oriented. With my nonprofit project, Mystic Soul, one of our core ethos is rhythm over time, so this idea of decolonizing time. So this is helpful. I'm going to try to colonize my time for the purposes of what we need to do here in this space. To open, I'd like to take 3 deep breaths together. So just get grounded wherever you are, sitting or standing. Holding ourselves in this space, in this moment, in the particular way that we're showing up, not just in our minds and our spirits, but also in our bodies. Big, deep inhale in, full, deep exhale out. Big, deep inhale in, full, deep exhale out. Big, deep inhale in, full, deep exhale out. And I invite you into this time together that we share, that I'm sharing space with you, but I also feel that I'm sharing space across time with those that came before me, with the ancestors that are known and unknown to me, and with those that come ahead of me that will pave the future that we cannot even see yet. So I want to begin with a quote from Gloria Anzaldúa, who's one of my favorite authors. Until I am free to write bilingually and to switch code without having to always translate, while I still have to speak English or Spanish when I would rather speak Spanglish, and as long as I have to accommodate the English speakers rather than having them accommodate me, my tongue will be illegitimate. I will no longer be made to feel ashamed of existing. I will have my voice. Indian, Spanish, white. I will have my serpent's tongue, my woman's voice, my sexual voice, my poet's voice. I will overcome the tradition of silence. So what I want to speak into is this idea of difference and the way in which we hold the differences of each other as a sacred practice of honoring each other, and the essence of that being a radical way of loving one another. And it begins for me with this concept of exterminating this silence, the silence and the oppression and the shame of being and becoming exactly who we were meant to be in the fullness of who that is. And owning those pieces of ourselves, not as a way of pulling ourselves away from each other and away from a divine unity and an understanding and seeing of one another, but actually as a way of being in our fullness and our wholeness in such abundance that it actually accentuates and expands the way that we can hold each other in unity, that we can be grounded in the way that we are transcendent collectively rather than individually and individualistically. I myself am always what I call, as a trauma therapist, my first and foremost case study. So when I want to study something, I start with me as the body of material and I move outward. And I also see that as a very POC or people of color centered and indigenous model, that story and community and identity and ancestry is also a key and core component of not how just we know ourselves at an individual level, but we understand our collective knowing and that we understand community across time. So I am an Indo-Latinx queer woman. I am an immigrant. I'm an international adoptee. And the complexity of all those pieces has taken me much of my lifetime up until this present moment to hold in a way that I feel like I can, that is abundant and not shameful, that is voiced and has voice rather than being silenced or being silent in space where I felt that I was in the margins. And in that way, the complexity of it also is the complexity of the history of the world that we live in and exist in. Being Colombian, but also being adopted to the United States means that there was a loss of language and a loss of culture, that I was extracted from into a loving family, but one that held different cultural identities than the one I was born into, that held different language identities than the one that I was born into. And as a result, this great abundance of love that carried me into a life and a loving family was also one of loss and erasure. And one of the things that I learned along my own road of trying to own the identity of holding myself between worlds, between languages, between English and Spanish, where I was assumed to know Spanish fluently, but had learned it alongside all of the other people in high school English class, where I was assumed to have particular cultural identity, particular food orientations, where I learned from my father to eat scones, but people assumed I loved empanadas, which I do, but I had to learn that later in life. In a place in which I was always some of this and some of that, but not quite enough of anything to fit in one particular space. But what I learned along the way, the more that I told my story and I found communities of others that were telling their stories, was that actually as a woman of color, as a queer woman of color, as an immigrant, that just because I was an adoptee, my story was actually not unique. That there's a generation and generations before that of loss, of erasure, of identity, of culture, of who we came from, whose we are and who we are in the fullness as a result of the history of colonization, oppression, marginalization, homophobia, patriarchy, anti-Semitism, anti-everything. All of the identities that have been marginalized over time is not just my experience to live in this place between, with not all of myself, but pieces of myself fragmented over time. That actually it's something that's more common than I ever thought. And actually, it's something that is not just common for myself as a person of color, but actually for everybody. Because the fragmentation of colonization and oppression and marginalization and the erasure of culture and history is not just that of people of color, it's actually all of ours. That we all hold memory loss of where we came from, of whose we are, of the cultures, the identities, the languages, the indigeneities of the places that we came from the ancestors that we came from, that erasure is actually a great loss that is global, that is universal in many ways. Although the way that manifests around power and privilege looks different, we've all lost something. And also, simultaneously to this journey for myself of sort of finding who I was, being able to speak into that truth in any space, wherever I was this feeling and expression that I often saw in spiritual spaces where we get so overwhelmed with this straight shot to transcendence, to unification, to oneness, that actually erases the difference that many of us has been seeking to find and that all of us actually need to own so that we can live in the full abundance of a unity that is more authentic and more full. And so in speaking today, I wanted to speak into that uncomfortable sometimes place in between where we actually have to see difference to see the abundance of transformation. And also where we have to be able to understand that even though in a consumeristic Western culture, we are often taught that our path to spiritual unity is one that we actually tread often very isolated and individualistically, that actually the whole process is a communal project. And that the act of seeing one another in our fullness and our wholeness for all that we are, and all of the manifestations of difference that we have, is actually a part of that communal project towards wholeness. And it's actually a critical part, a foundational part of the way in which we create social change in the world. We cannot create social change if we don't see the difference in one another, if we don't see the beauty and the value and the pain and the oppression and all of the stories that make up our difference. If we cannot see that, we cannot fully live into and embody what we want to change in the world. And I do believe that our transcendence as individual beings is deeply tied to this collective healing and transcendence of the pain and the suffering of our past, to the ownership of the beauty of who we are in our full, authentic selves, which have been stunted for all of us in some way, shape, or form by the oppressions and the pain and the suffering that the world has exposed us to, that our history has exposed us to, that white supremacy has exposed us to, that white privilege has exposed us to, that commercialization and capitalization have exposed us to. And so part of holding our own transcendence has to be in unity and in union with the collective expression of who we are, with seeing each other fully exactly as we are, and in holding the fragility and the pain and the grief and the joy of who another is, that is actually the gateway for us to care about another, care about another person, care about another issue that may not be directly related to us enough to want to create the kind of change that we need in the world right now. In a world that is very much on fire in many ways. And I love the language of fire. There's also a word in Spanish called fuerte, which means passion, but also means fieriness. That's one of my favorite words. Because fire is both. It is purification, it is power, it is strength, it is passion, but it's also disruption, it can be chaos, it can be devastation. And I see the world that we're living in right now as one that is on fire, in both the full beauty of that and the danger of it. But in that fire, we're being called into a place to be and see in the fullness of who we are and in the fullness of who each other are, as a gateway and as an entry point to caring about the world so that we might change the world that we're in as actually a baseline necessity of the spiritual journey. That we have to in some way be engaged not just with our own personal journey of transformation, but a collective process that is bound up in the silence and the voicing of another person, in seeing all the truths and the panoply of truths across time. That we cannot transcend, we cannot find that unity, we cannot find that collective oneness unless we are deeply connected and bound to one another in all of those places and spaces of difference. Thanks. I want us to do a practice in a moment because I'm, as a therapist and also as a practitioner of spiritual practice, I don't think we can just talk about things. The way that the brain works, our speech center is not directly connected with our embodied center, and so actually that's been one of the major issues of talk therapy over time, is that we connect at one level, but we don't actually bring it into the embodied feeling state of ourselves. But before we get to the practice, I just wanted to speak to the piece in my talk that I described as the cosmic mirror. So there's all these wonderful conceptions and talking about science, which my geek is loving, like bringing all of the brain science and the body science and the mapping together. And I actually really love the concept of mirroring neurons, this idea that in this sort of mimicry and this ability to see the way that another is moving and being and feeling, that we can actually embrace some element and be in unity, in connection in some element with the other. But I also think that science is a language and an expression of us understanding the infinite. And so it's only a portion, it's only ever a portion of the answer or of the information of what actually is accessible in the universe. And so the idea of a cosmic mirror to me means more than just the neurological, biological response that when I see you, I feel a sort of expression of how you're responding to the world, and some part of me is either mimicking that or connecting to that. But this idea of the cosmic mirror as a way of actually beyond just the mimicry of it, a deep indwelling connection to another through seeing the other in a way that is deeply embodied and deeply bound up in spirit and in feeling and in being our whole selves. So I want to take 3 deep breaths together again. Big deep inhale in. Big deep exhale out. Big deep inhale in. Big deep exhale out. One more big deep inhale in, and release and exhale out. And then the practice that I want us to do is find somebody that is next to you in a moment. And I'd like to take maybe just a minute, I'll let you know when the time's up, but take just a minute or so to share with your partner something that you would like them to see or know about you in the moment. And coming from my sort of holding space from a therapeutic perspective, something that you're willing to share with another within your own comfort, within your own safety, that's completely up to you how you share what you share, and also with the understanding that we're holding it in this space together, and that within your duo, you're holding it for each other, and you're not carrying whatever they tell you out to anyone else. So it is shared just within the dyad of you and another. So each share something that you want the person to know or see about you in some specific way and whatever way you're comfortable. So we'll just take a minute, turn to somebody next to you, share something that you want them to see about you or know about you. And then just slowly close up or finish up whatever you were just saying to your partner. Coming back to focus in the center together. I know it's hard to stop, but if you can, pause where you are. If everyone can pause where they are, knowing that you've said enough of what you can about what you want to share about the other. So if everyone can turn forward again. Stay with your partner, but turn forward again. Staying with your partner and turning forward again. So I want you to, thanks. So holding what your partner has said to you, I want you to hold in whatever words, whatever embodiment, whatever feeling states are associated with your expression of yourself and what you heard of the other person. We're going to take 3 more deep breaths together. So big, deep inhale in. Big, deep exhale out. Big, deep inhale in. Big, deep exhale out. One more big, deep inhale in. Big, deep exhale out. And then I want you to turn to your partner one more time. This time is going to be wordlessly. And we're going to do the practice of eye gazing, which many of you have likely done before in some version or manifestation. But in this particular iteration, I'd like you to hold whatever the other person has given you to hold. The sacredness of their difference, of their self, of their wholeness, and of their truth. Hold that at the center of yourself, at the seat of what I would call your soul, however you identify that grounding place. And see the person from that place of knowing them just this little fraction more than you did a moment ago. So we're going to take 1 minute, turn to your partner again, gazing into their eyes and holding that sacred knowledge of who they are in their difference, without language, just in silence and in seeing. And then slowly and gently bring your attention back into the surrounding space. Give your silent thanks in whatever way you'd like to your partner who shared in just this moment of glimpsing each other in our wholeness and our sacred difference, in that practice of radical love of seeing each other exactly as we are. Thank you.